What's up, guys? Chris Hayre with you on a brand new episode of Chargers Weekly. Coming up a bit later, Jeff Miller of the LA Times joins me. We'll talk mini camp last week. But first, Ryan O'Halloran of the Denver Post. Now that we are in between mini camp and training camp, we're going to do our Know Your Rivals series. We're going to kick it off with the Denver Broncos. Ryan, a friend of the podcast, always appreciate your time, man. How are you?
Good, Chris. Good to join you again.
Absolutely, man. So how's the offseason been for you?
You know, it's probably like for a lot of people who try to cover this league, it's still nauseating. But slowly but surely, the Broncos did a decent job in terms of we had in-person press conferences for the draft and some of free agency stuff. So allowed a little bit more of a, give and take there. But enough about me. As far as the Broncos go, they loaded up on defense during the offseason. They made no bones that, hey, they ran out of corners last year. They ran out of defensive linemen last year, and it impacted the results. So new GM George Payton was hired in January, got a 6-year contract, and he went about rebuilding the secondary, re-signing some guys. And then in the draft, he went for the stand-up double instead of the grand slam, went with Surtain over Fields.
The secondary is kind of where I want to start because you bring in Ronald Darby, then Kyle Fuller becomes available. Obviously, a Vic Fangio guy from his time in Chicago, and then you bring in Surtain. Couple that with Von Miller coming back. We always talk about the rushing cover working together, especially in the AFC West. Was that kind of Peyton's strategy, is just load up on DBs based on what happened last year and also who's in the division, especially in Los Angeles and Kansas City?
Yeah, and I agree. And I'll throw Las Vegas in there because it feels like Derek Carr rarely throws an incomplete pass against the Broncos. And it's literally like his completion percentage is like 75 or 80%. So I think it was a division-wide thing. Is you got Herbert twice, Mahomes twice, Carr twice. You have to be able to cover. You have to be able to create some turnovers, which this team hasn't been able to do the last 2 years. So, Ronald Darby was the first signing from Washington. They jumped on Kyle Fuller right away. He has familiarity with Fangio. They signed him like 24 hours after he was cut. And then, conservative approach with the 9th pick. They said the usual. You didn't think Surtain would be there. Well, Carolina was the only team in front of him at 8 that was going to probably take him. They took J.C. Horn. I got criticized as usual by the fan base for saying you got to take the quarterback there. You never thought Justin Fields would have been there at 9, but Surtain could be a multi-time All-Pro, never make the playoffs. So you got to find a way to jumpstart this offense. But right now the plan is, hey, rush and cover, Miller and Chubb off the edges, Shelby Harris, interior pass rusher, Draymond Jones, interior pass rusher. And then I think they're going to play a lot of dime to get all 4 corners, Bryce Callahan being the 4th guy on the field with those 2 safeties.
So I was going to wait to talk quarterback. Let's just get into it. Drew Lock, Teddy Bridgewater, you mentioned Justin Fields being available there. What's the confidence level that Drew Lock's going to be the guy in 2021, and how close is that gap between him and Teddy? Is this an open competition, and how open is it really this offseason?
Well, there's snaps during the times we watched during the offseason program were 50-50, which is what Vic Fangio said. When training camp starts, he says it's going to pretty much end up like that. I think it's Teddy's job to lose. He's the veteran. You don't bring him in to be the backup without a competition. So I think Teddy would have to really struggle in August. Drew Lock would have to be really good in August for them to have to stick with Lock. And I think if you look at the Broncos schedule, at the Giants, at the Jaguars, home to the Jets. If Vic Fangio wants to have success this year, minimum 2-1. And I think his view is going to be his defense is going to be able to stop those offenses. So he wants a quarterback who won't lose the game. Game manager, that's a perfectly fine term. So I think Teddy's going to be the guy in week 1. But when you watch the 2 quarterbacks, Drew has tons of velocity, gets it there quicker. Teddy knows where to go with it probably better. So if you can meld those 2, then you'd have a quarterback. But I think both guys are going to start games this year unless they trade for Aaron Rodgers, which I think everybody here is holding out hope for that happens from a story perspective and a fan perspective.
What's interesting about the game manager thing, especially when you look at this Broncos offense and the skill position players, you got Cortland Sutton coming back. you drafted Kid Williams from UNC in the second round to pair with Melvin Gordon. You got Noah Fant. You got Jerry Jeudy. It's like game managers. You got weapon. You could score a lot of points. Does Locke give them more of an opportunity to score, but it's just too risky in terms of what he does and not being careful with the football? Or do you think that Teddy can be a little bit more than a game manager given the weapons that he has at his disposal?
Yeah, I'll start with Locke. He's probably going to be the guy that would produce more explosive plays, but also more turnovers. And you like his confidence. If he didn't have the turnover problem last year and they went 5-11, he'd probably still be the starter, unquestionably. So with Teddy, he's probably playing with a set of skill players that probably since Minnesota are the best he's been with. So he has to take advantage of that chance. And can they? I think Cortland Sutton's the key because he'll take pressure off Jeudy. He'll take pressure off Hamler. And Noah Fant, middle of the field, should be open if teams want to play cover 2 against Sutton and Jeudy. So, if they can get even remotely consistent play at quarterback, they should be able to, get past that 20-point threshold or 22-point threshold that's been such a roadblock for the last half decade.
In the running game, I mentioned Williams and then Melvin Gordon. You got Phillip Lindsay, who's out of there in Houston now. The running game, too, could be a quarterback's best friend, especially if you're trying to just rely on your defense and churn out the clock, get first downs. Williams, was that surprising to you? Did they went for him early in the second?
That early, yes, that they chose a running back and they traded up 5 spots, 5-6 spots with Atlanta. And maybe I'm over dramatizing this, but they have the war room camera during the draft weekend. And when they made that trade and made that pick, you saw a high five and you saw fist pumps. You saw a couple hugs.
It looked like a Super Bowl.
Yeah, to me, that meant they're drafting their starter. And, Melvin Gordon was a no-show through OTAs. You're familiar with that. He came back from minicamp. I think it could be a situation where Melvin Gordon takes that first snap of the season. But by the time October comes, Javonte Williams is your number one. And that's what it should be. I mean, I think Melvin may be better suited for a different kind of role at this stage. He sniffed 1,000 yards last year. I don't remember more than 2 great runs that he had, one against the Jets and one against Kansas City, I think. So, they like Javonte Williams. They think he'd be a 3-down guy. So they did maybe, definitely draft earlier than I thought. With Phillip Lindsay moving on to Houston, you figured they would address it at some point, but they felt Javonte Williams was the best running back in the draft, even though he wasn't the first one picked. So they pounced on him.
The AFC West, Chargers, Chiefs, Raiders. When you look at the Broncos, what they did this offseason, and then you look at the rest of the division, how do you think the Broncos stack up? And obviously the pecking order starts with Kansas City, but after that, it's interesting. The Chargers made some moves we could talk about because I want to talk about Brandon Staley. But how do you view the division? Do you view the gap between Kansas City and everybody else closer than it's been in the past?
No, and that's not so much a knock on the other 3 teams as it is Kansas City has found a way to keep their stars. And they spent a lot of money to rebuild that offensive line, which, I mean, they were terrible in the Super Bowl. They weren't very good in the regular season either. So that was going to be a priority either way. And they're so good on offense, it just covers up a lot of warts on defense. But as far as the Chargers, Raiders, and Broncos, I don't want to say pick a name out of a hat, but it's pretty close to that. I think they're pretty evenly matched. The Chargers, I think there's always a transition with a first-time head coach who also has first-time coordinators. And, can Herbert pick up where he left off in a new scheme? The Raiders, to me, it feels like they're chasing their tail a little bit more than the Broncos and the Chargers. But they did sign a lot of guys, and I think they have Darren Waller and Derek Carr. So if I had to do a power ranking in late June, Chiefs obviously number 1. I'd go Chargers 2, Raiders 3, Broncos 4, because I think Herbert is that good.
In addition to Staley, Ronaldo Hill spent some time with the Broncos, obviously. Your thoughts on Ronaldo kind of overseeing this defense? We know it's going to be a Brandon Staley defense. It's going to be a Vic Fangio defense. Those 2 guys who I know you're very familiar with, what do you think their impact's going to be here in LA?
Well, you look at Ronaldo. I'll start with Ronaldo. He really did fly under the radar here. I interviewed him maybe two or three times in 2 years. I can't remember anybody else talking to him. So, but he ran the safeties. Ed Donatello was more of the corners coach as the defensive coordinator. But you look at, let's say Ronaldo's work at safety, Justin Simmons, Kareem Jackson. They signed Jackson in free agency, moved him from corner to safety. So that took a little bit of transition. People here looked at Ronaldo as a rising coordinator, and he took advantage of that opportunity. In terms of Brandon Staley, he was just here that 1 year as the outside linebackers coach. Then out of nowhere, he gets the coordinator job in LA. And if I was the Broncos, this is revisionist history. You look back and say, should you have tried and kept him? Should you have tried to expand his role a little bit? Vic Fangio was the play caller. I asked that last year to a executive with the Broncos. I said, did Vic ever think about giving up the play calling? What? Are you kidding me? So I took that as a no. I think if the Chargers are looking for the energetic, I don't care about age. If you have energy, you have expertise, and you have a rep, Brandon Staley checks all those boxes. And if you're a Charger fan, last week your Twitter put up him mic'd up during a mini camp practice.
Yeah,
that's what you're going to get. And when it's adversity, he's going to point the finger at himself. But when the Chargers win that first game, week 1 or whenever, he's going to be the one saying, that guy did it, that guy did it, that guy did it.
Your article, I think it was the week of the Green Bay game. The Rams played the Packers, and it was right before Staley was hired. If you haven't read it, go to the Denver Post, search Ryan's name, search Brandon Staley's name, you'll find it. There was so many good nuggets in there just about Staley's kind of grind to get to where he's been. But also the fact that I think it was Ed Donatel had a quote at the end that said that this is kind of like Sean McVay 2.0, but he has a feel for all three phases of the game, right? Offense, defense, special teams. He sees the game differently from just, let's say, a defensive coordinator or a guy who is an offensive specialist. He played quarterback in college. Is that kind of consensus in Denver in terms of the impact Staley had in his short time there and what people saw in him?
Yeah, and Brandon got to coach Bradley Chubb for 4 games before he tore his ACL, and their offense was terrible, so he couldn't really unleash those edge rushers. But I think you hit the key point about Brandon is he played offense in college, and then he goes to St. Thomas in Minnesota, Division III school as a defensive line coach. And I think his brother said, "What do you know about defense? You're a quarterback." And he says, "Hey, I'm going to learn." And you look at all those stops, and people say, why did he go to Hutchinson Junior College for 2 years? Well, because he could run his own defense, and all the things percolating in his head throughout his playing career and coaching career to that point were there. And you learn so much when you have to do everything, regardless of the level. And, then he goes from James Madison, a 1 AA power, back to John Carroll, Division III school, basically with the same title. So, because I think, as he said, that was he wanted to go back to that area of the country, learn from that program, and then he goes from John Carroll straight to the Bears. So it's been, I don't want to call it, people use roller coaster as a negative, but it's been a roller coaster journey in terms of what levels of football he's been at. And I think that's going to benefit him everywhere, being in Vic's system, getting that year running the Rams defense for a coach with McVay who runs the offense. So I think he's prepared for this opportunity.
It's a great point. You could compare it to somebody who's been in the NFL, let's say, for 10 years, but has had like kind of the same role versus someone like Staley who's been at multiple stops, but there was purpose behind why he was doing it, right? To control a defense, to run a defense, to do some of these things. He said it more than one time about John Carroll, how that program has prepared him for the NFL more than anything, because how they do things is kind of like how the NFL does things.
Yeah. I mean, it's like an NFL factory for executives.
Yeah. It is
pretty much for executives. Now you have some of these coaches as well. And I think the key thing for Brandon, if you're a Charger fan, is getting that year of play calling experience. Had he been a non-play calling coordinator and then been hired as the head coach and says, "I'm going to call the plays," that's a lot on your plate. So I think last year was beneficial in terms of he had a nuclear weapon in Aaron Donald. He had a great corner in Jalen Ramsey. Now he gets to go to the Chargers where he has Joey Bosa, he has Derwin James. So he learned how to relate and design his defense for his best players. And I think he's going to do that with the Chargers.
Yeah, Bosa and Derwin are kind of those guys with the Chargers. And you mentioned Ronaldo Hill and his work with Justin Simmons. Derwin and Nasir Adderley is the guy that I'm really excited about to see what he does next to Derwin and with Ronaldo Hill coaching him, especially his work with Simmons. And, the last thing that was that I want to talk about that was in your article that was relevant to last week, Drew Brees was at camp and you talked about how Coach Staley spent some time in New Orleans, and Coach Staley actually mentioned it too. He got to see how Drew worked with Joe Lombardi and Pete Carmichael. And it's funny how things have come full circle. 20 years, the Chargers have had 3 starting quarterbacks, Brees and Herbert sharing the field last week, and Staley kind of overseeing everything, knowing that he was down there. I think it was 2009, kind of seeing how all this stuff works. Now Joe Lombardi's his coordinator. Brees is in the booth watching Justin Herbert, who's the franchise quarterback now.
Yeah, and those visits are not in a guy's Wikipedia page. Like,
no.
When he sat in for 2 weeks here, or he visited this coach here. And, one thing about Brandon as well is after the 2017 season in Chicago, when they wiped out the head coach, he went down to Alabama and interviewed with Nick Saban. So I said, what was that like? He talked for like 5 minutes, he says he couldn't believe the detail. But then Dick was retained as coordinator and said, hey, I'd like to keep you here when Matt Nagy took over. So it's, one thing about successful coaches at any level is they know what they don't know, and they're sponges for information. And you never think 12 years ago, sitting in a Saints quarterback room with Joe Lombardi and Pete Carmichael, that now they are working together, Lombardi and Staley, with the Chargers. And basically, Drew Brees can be such a resource for Herbert because of the respect he has for Lombardi.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating how a coach's life works, especially when you go to multiple stops, and it all kind of comes together in full circle. So Ryan O'Halloran, Denver Post, man, I always love our conversations. Some great insight on the Broncos, man. I can't wait to see you out here in the fall at SoFi Stadium, and it should be a fun year. The AFC West, again, the Chiefs are the favorite, but you never know what's going to happen. And I think that this division has a lot of fun storylines and a lot of firepower. You mentioned Vegas too, but with Denver and the Chargers offensively, it should be fun. A lot of points here in 2021.
Yeah, and I think the Chargers and Broncos don't play till like really late in the season, and then they play twice in the span of a month. So I think I'm flying in LA on New Year's night. So we'll have a January 2nd road game.
I saw you at SoFi. It'll look a little bit different with a packed house, right?
Good. And hopefully for both teams' fan bases, that game has some meaning, which you could very well be.
Yep, absolutely. Ryan, thanks so much, man.
Okay, Chris.
All right, as we roll on here on Chargers Weekly, another friend of the podcast, Jeff Miller, LA Times. And Jeff, obviously, we're going to talk some mini camp, but I have to start here. On Sunday, I saw you tweet out a link about Colt Brennan and his story in the LA Times. If you haven't read it after this podcast, please go do so. It's an incredible piece. It's an emotional piece. I just have to start with this. Just what was the process like putting something like this together? Obviously, everyone knows your work through the Chargers, but this was an important piece to tell, and I know it affected a lot of people.
Yeah, it really did. Just from the reaction we got from it, Colt died May 11th, and so somebody in the office reached out to me the next day, and maybe 2 days later, and said, "Hey, we'd like to do something more involved on this, and just rather than just run a quick story that he had passed away." So it was probably about a week. Not quite a week afterward, I reached out to his family, and there was a little bit of a process in trying to get his mom and dad to sort of figure out why should we do this? What's the point? And I think the idea from their end was just this could maybe help some people, and it was sort of that idea of we could get this story out there, and it would sort of give some I don't want to say silver lining, that's kind of cliche and trite, but it would give some meaning to what is otherwise a pretty meaningless death of somebody 37 years old and overdosed on drugs. And so once the family was okay, yeah, we can sit down and talk about this. It just started from there. And but it was yeah, I have to give his parents credit, Terry and Betsy. They were very open, very honest, and very willing to. They gave me a bunch of time. They shared a bunch of photos with us, a bunch of memories. His sister Chanel also, she was in one of our conversations. So I have to give his family a lot of credit. That story had the impact it had because of them and their willingness to open up and share.
And this is a story right in our backyard here in Orange County. I mean, this is a local kid who was I don't know, he was a rock star in Hawaii at the quarterback position. Even we were just talking offline. I worked for the Washington football team a long time ago. And I remember this was after my time there, but in 2008, just how electric he was during that preseason and how fans just gravitated towards this guy, very similar to his time in Hawaii. So he had that like it factor, Jeff, on the field that really kind of brought people in to him.
Yeah, he really did. And I talked to his high school coach, Bruce Rollinson at Mater Dei, which is a private school in Santa Ana. And he told me when Colt showed up, he walks on campus and freshman, kind of a gangly, skinny kid. And other kids, you know, not in a bullying way, but in a fun way, they made fun. They kind of, I don't say made fun of him, but they kind of played jokes on him. They would, you know, he's a kid that, you know, in gym class, they would steal his shoes. So he'd come after class, he'd have his shoes would be gone. It's just silly stuff like that. And what happened was Colt played along with it and went along with the gags and kind of it just became part of it. He didn't mind that people were having fun, you know, at his expense, so to speak. And that kind of opened up other kids' eyes and say, hey, this kid's might be okay. You know, maybe we should give him a chance. And Bruce told me and by the time he was done at Mater Dei, he was so popular. Now, he didn't play in high school until his senior year because Matt Leinart was a quarterback there. So it's not like
a little bit of a quarterback powerhouse there.
Yeah. It's not like Colt was a football star. He hadn't really played. So but other kids gravitated to him and he had this charisma to him, this sort of charm. He had a big smile. Bruce said he never nothing ever got to him. He was very laid back, very cool. And I think it was that sort of vibe that attracted other people. And that never went away. He had that, you know, through his time at Hawaii. And then obviously they had the success they had out there and that just made it explode more. And then you mentioned Washington, D.C., you know, playing, you know, he never played in a game, a real NFL game for Washington. And he's still a very popular player there. You know, I mentioned to you before we started, I've done 3 interviews there with media outlets wanting just to talk about him and their memories about him. And just because they know what an impact he had there. And again, he never even played in a real NFL game. He just played one preseason and then got hurt the next preseason. But you know, he really had that, you said it, that it factor. He had that, whatever it is, that charm, that magnetism that certain people just have, he had it.
And the connections to Colt, even your time on the Chargers beat, I think you talked to Feoko about his impact because Feoko's dad was in Hawaii at the time.
Yeah, it was interesting. I wasn't sure, so I reached out through the Chargers to find out, you know, between Alohi Gilman, who grew up in Hawaii, and then Braden Feoko. Do either of these guys know him? I thought there's a pretty good chance that they both would. Their age, they would have been at that age where they could have grown up watching those games. And then when with Braden's dad, it was like, you know, he must have been at some of those games. Well, I get on the phone with Braden and he just lit up. And I'll tell you, all I really need to tell you about that is we talked for probably 10 or 15, 20 minutes and he's just sharing his memories of Colt. And he was a little kid and going to the games and on the field before the game playing catch with Colt and just watching him sign autographs and pose with pictures and all that stuff and just how great that team was and how great that era of Hawaii football was. We got done and Braden said to me, hey, I really want to thank you for giving me a chance to relive all these stories. He said, I feel
Wow.
like I'm a kid again. I hadn't thought about this stuff in years. So he actually thanked me for interviewing him, which, that doesn't happen very often in this profession. So that, again, that I took that as more, that's another sign of the impact that Cole had is just the fact that a player would do that now.
Mm. Well, Jeff, you always do stellar work, but I couldn't recommend this piece enough for Chargers fans that haven't read it. I mean, it's just very impactful. So go ahead and check that out. Jeff, we'll segue to the Chargers. And last week, minicamp kind of put the final touches on this offseason. What did you take from last week? And really, what are you taking going into these next 5 weeks as we prepare for training camp?
Yeah, there's a lot, everybody's optimistic, right? No one's lost a game yet, so they all should be optimistic.
Everybody's 0-0.
No, so, and there's a lot of optimism, obviously, with this team. And I think they're going to, the big thing right now, as far as we know, everybody's healthy, right? We all expect Kenneth Murray to be, he was kind of held back at mini camp, but I think he has the expectation. Everybody has the expectation he'll be good to go once they open up camp. And sitting here right now, unless I'm missing somebody, they're healthy, right? As far as we know. So that's a good thing. So they're physically, they're healthy. Mentally, I think they're healthy, because I think there's a lot of optimism in that building. There's a lot of belief in the new coaching staff, which is huge. The biggest thing that, they're going to have to, these two new systems, offense and defense, these players are going to have to be up to speed on what's going on. And a lot of it is, we've heard them all talk about communication and being aware of everything and having to know multiple things. Joey Bosa the other day said this is more involved defense than he's ever played in. But he also made a point to share with us that he is fully confident that he and the coaches will make sure by the time the season starts, they'll have it down pat, which I suspect they will. I mean, they're not trying to do something that's never been done before. I mean, this is very similar as defense. I'm sure to what the Rams did last year, and it worked out great for that team. And they had no postseason or off season, traditional off season like everybody else, and they were able to get to the point where they took this defense and made it number one in the league. So it's going to be an important 5 weeks between now and then, just for the players to get on board with the terminology and all the scheme. But I think, given that you get into the preseason, hopefully we'll have these 3 preseason games this time around. It'll give them a chance to maybe get a better look at what it's supposed to look like, what the basic stuff's going to look like. And if they can get through training camp healthy, get through the preseason healthy, and have this scheme down, I see why there's a lot of optimism. There should be.
Yeah, there should be. But to your point, there's optimism around the league when everybody's 0-0. You forget about adversity in April and May, right? What happens throughout the course of now a 17-game season. And I think that's what's going to be key for this Chargers team, because adversity is going to strike. There's 100% chance of that with all 32 teams. It's going to strike at some point, whether it's training camp, first quarter of the season, whatever. How do you respond to that? How are you going to respond from a mental standpoint if you lose a close game, or you're still trying to get the system down and a couple things don't go your way? How do you sustain the positivity and kind of staying the course when things that you don't expect to happen? And I think that's going to be really what we're seeing in September is like, okay, it's not always going to be roses. There's going to be adversity. How do you respond to it?
Yeah, and this Charger team is a perfect example of we've seen it the last 3 years. In 2018, they kept it together. They won all those close games, and they made the playoffs, won a playoff game, and did all that. The last 2 years, they didn't win all those close games. They lost most of them, so you don't have to look outside this team to figure out how this works. It's pretty obvious. This team traditionally has played close games. And if they can keep it together, overcome the injuries that they're going to have some that everybody does, that if they can win those close games, get some momentum going, get the belief going, they can be they can be a playoff contending team, no question. But as we've seen the last couple of years, when it goes the other way, it's as much as that momentum builds, it also it becomes almost an inevitability, that snowball effect, where you just can tell this team's not, it's just not this team's season. So if you're a Charger fan, you don't have to like look around the league to see how this works. All you got to do is look at your team over the last 3 years. We've seen a perfect example of how this league works, basically.
You know what I found interesting is the fact that the coaches talked about the amount of reps that everybody got during OTAs and how that's really uncommon around the league. You know, we heard a lot of talk about, hey, typically you get, 10, 15, 20 reps, whatever, as opposed to like the 60, 65 reps that players were getting on both fields. I found that interesting, especially when you're learning a new system. You want to get these young guys specifically as many reps as possible during mini camp. So when training camp comes, there are no surprises, and you have at least a base of what to expect and, what you need to do going into late July.
Yeah, and it's a really simple concept, right? It's not that difficult. The more people you have engaged at one time, the more work you're getting in. Like, I don't know, when I played, we didn't have face masks and leather helmets. It was a million years ago. But I don't know if you remember this, Chris, but we'd all stand in these two giant lines doing stuff, and you'd have to wait at the end of the line till your turn.
Yeah, just wait. You sit around.
Understand? So obviously, at some point, people have figured out, okay, that's not very efficient. So, but it seems really simple, but it takes someone to do it and to actually put it into motion. And Brandon Staley has done that, and I think it's obviously it's really smart, and it's much better use of everybody's time. So yeah, I think the other thing that not everybody, fans may not understand this at all. All these practices are filmed; they're all taped. And so you not only are doing it in real time, then you take the tape, and then you've got a whole learning tool, and you got this whole way to learn off the field. And the players will now all have they all have their cut-ups of themselves, of their offense, defense, whatever their position group. I mean, they've got all that information. They can just watch those replays over and over, and the techniques, and see what they did right, see what they did wrong. And so it's a much more efficient way of doing things. And it's one of these things, I'm sure I think it's an evolving thing. I think a lot of teams are probably doing this now, starting to do this. And in a few more years, I think everybody will be doing a version of it, just because, somebody along the way figured out this is just a lot better use of our time. But it was, I think the Chargers got a lot of work in for doing most of what they did at, kind of walk through pace. I think it was a lot of quality work, and the players certainly, what their comments reflected, that they felt that way.
Yeah, and most importantly, you go into camp healthy, which is priority A here. Hey, final thing for you, your one or two storylines going into training camp that you're going to be locked in on as we go through this process of getting to September.
Well, the main one, I think most people would say, is the offensive line. That's we've got to see how that comes together. I think defensively, they're going to be fine. We all know the talent they've got on that side of the ball. I think with Staley he's the head coach, but it's going to be basically his defense. We've seen what that defense can do, and I don't think there's any reason to think, oh, why would it work here? If it doesn't work here, it'd be very surprising, unless they just have a slew of injuries and it just falls apart that way. I don't know why it wouldn't work. So I think it starts on the offensive line, and they've rebuilt that thing. And again, we keep talking about health, but we saw last year with Brian Bulaga, he just couldn't stay on the field, and that really cost him. So if they can stay healthy, and they've got a young left tackle, and if he can develop into what they think he's going to be eventually, and what a lot of people think he's going to be eventually, they have a chance to be really good. But I think on this team, I think the success of this team is going to hinge on that offensive line being able to protect Herbert, give the running backs a chance. And I mean, we saw what Herbert did playing behind a pretty shaky offensive line. Just imagine what he might be able to do if he just has a little more time, a little more protection, has one more option he could go. I mean, he could it's scary to think he could take a leap forward, but I think he has that opportunity.
Yeah, that extra second and a half, or just opening up holes in the running game to get him into more manageable situations in the red zone and beyond. So I'm excited. It's a well-deserved 5 weeks off for you, though. You got any plans?
That is still in negotiation right now. Hopefully, I'll be able to disappear here for at least a couple of weeks at some point between now and the end of July. So I know, and you too. Hopefully you get a blow somewhere in here. You just work through it.
Yeah, I'm taking a little break. 4th of July. We're Chargers Weekly is off 4th of July. We're gonna take a week off. So Jeff Miller, LA Times. Always appreciate it, man. I look forward to seeing you soon.
All right, Chris. Thank you so much.